So hi everyone, thanks for coming out, being here. Welcome to the Forum on European Culture. Welcome in the Bali. Well, obviously we had a bit of a change in the way we usually do this over here. Usually, I think 6 months ago, this room would have probably been packed. Today we're simply happy enough to finally some form to be here all together. Before I'm going to start with Orlando Figes and his, I must say, very handsomely new book. Very handsome editions, Europeans of Europeanen in het Nederlands uitgegeven bij Nieuw Amsterdam. We're going to start with some housekeeping announcements. This is like the formal part. And after the formal part, I'm obliged to say something in camera because everything is going to be, recorded for posterity. So let me start with some housekeeping announcements. Obviously because we have limited capacity in the building, we've set up a live stream for the many people watching back home or wherever they are. That means we're going to make something that sometimes might look a bit like a TV program, and I'll have to be looking in the camera to make an introduction. So if that might be a bit awkward, don't feel awkward. I'll feel awkward enough for all of us. And also don't feel awkward if I don't address you directly. I've seen everyone here. I'm aware of you, but sometimes, my focus has to be over there. In all other respects, this program is just a regular program. We start out here at the table. Orlando Figes and I will talk. I've got a bunch of questions. And then after, a little while, you'll be able to ask your questions yourself. That, of course, is the great benefit of coming here and not watching the live stream. You get to ask some questions yourself, so think about them hard. After the program, I'll kindly ask you to give each other a little bit space once you're leaving the room. And if you like to drink or eat something after the program, you're more than welcome. But please make sure that you choose a table to sit down, and our bar staff will come to your table. Also, if you decide to eat something or drink here, and you want to financially support the Bali, just go ahead and order the most expensive thing on the menu and drink more drinks than you can possibly finish. That's it for now. We're going to start as soon as the technical team gives us the go-ahead, and a little bumper video is going to start, I think. So before we do that, please give a welcome already for Mr. Orlando Figes. And are we ready? Hi there. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome all, wherever you are. We are here in the heart of Amsterdam, at Leidseplein, in the Bali, where we'll be having a conversation that is part of the festival Forum on European Culture. My name is Joost de Vries, and I'll be the host for this program. The theme of the festival this year is We the People. Together with our guest speakers and our public, we will explore whether European people exist. And if so, who are they? We will explore in themes and exhibitions, in debate and film, in theater and interviews. European artists and thinkers alike, and their rich imagination will take center stage. Obviously, luckily enough, I'm not here by myself. I have a great guest. One of those rare historians who is comfortable with the grand political stuff, as well as with the intimate and the personal. He's written one of the best epic books on the Russian Revolution, A People's Tragedy. He's explored the Russian soul in his much lauded Natasha's Dance. He's written about how ordinary people dealt with Stalin's terror in The Whispers. And he wrote, if you ask me, one of the smartest books on the Crimean War. He is, of course, the historian Orlando Figes. Mr. Figes, thanks very much for being here. I suppose the most direct reason you're the perfect guest for this festival is your newest book, which might as well have been written especially for the festivals. It's called The Europeans. On the one hand, it's a portrait of the three-way friendship between the great Russian novelist Turgenev, the French singer of great renown, Pauline Viardot, and her husband Louis, the art connoisseur, art critic, art historian. On the other hand, Orlando Figes narrates the birth of a shared European cultural sensibility in the rapidly modernizing European society of the late 19th century. Considering literature, the arts, and also the trade network as a unifying, democratizing, and barrier-breaking force on the continent, what lessons can we learn for European society today? Can we take lessons for a new conception of a European demos? Or is there no such thing at all, as the populists like to proclaim? Thanks for being here, Orlando.
Thank you.
Did you have any difficulty getting here?
No.
Because you don't live in, you only live partly in
I
UK
sort of
anymore.
shuttled between London and Umbria in Italy.
Umbria,
and
that's
there
it.
was a very convenient flight from Perugia to Rotterdam, so it was fine. It was almost empty.
In your book, The Europeans, you document the emergence of a shared culture to the lens of the increasing change of arts and culture on the continent. And it does so by following the life and careers of three people. Some of them we might know, but for the people who hasn't read the book, there are Pauline and Louis Viardot and Ivan Turgenev. What brought you upon that threesome? Perhaps
I'm
for the
not
people who haven't read the book,
I'm not entirely sure how. I mean, I think I started just reading Turgenev's letters. He was a wonderful letter writer, and of course he knew virtually anybody worth knowing in the world of letters and music and the arts across Europe. Served as a great sort of cultural ambassador for many of them, particularly for the Russians wanting to make it into European markets. And of course, his great love was for Pauline Viardot, and so that got me very interested in her. There were some biographies written of her. And then her husband, certainly her husband when Turgenev meets her in 1843, Louis Viardot, much less of a known figure, but I found fascinating for all sorts of reasons. So, but how they then got to serve as a sort of armature for the bigger argument that you've already mentioned, I really can't remember.
But what came first, those three persons, or the
I can't remember. All I know is that there was this sort of I find Turgenev simpatico, and I just was luxuriating in reading. I mean, there are 20 volumes in the Soviet, now post-Soviet edition of his letters.
But Turgenev was well, how should we give a brief portrait of his character? Because we all know him probably as the author of Fathers and Sons and First Love, which is...
He was a sort of giant of a man, sort of 6'3" or something, lots of long white hair, the beard, and then strangely this high-pitched voice. He's a very generous-spirited, old-fashioned liberal, really, the best of what one might call the European Russian, who had studied with Bakunin. He was probably rubbing shoulders with Karl Marx in Berlin in the late 1830s. And so he's very well aware of this radical world that he portrays in the novel you mentioned, Fathers and Sons, but he's very much himself a sort of small deeds liberal, I think. But I find his worldview deeply sympathetic, and I think I was just so fed up with Russia and thinking about Russia, and I had these other languages that I sort of clung to Turgenev as the last palatable Russian I could find.
but at the same hand, Turgenev was also famed for his rivalries or his rather feisty connections with both Tolstoy and with Dostoevsky.
Yes.
I mean, he wasn't like the most cuttable person.
No, Dostoevsky hated him, probably because he could afford to be a gentleman writer. I mean, he could live effectively off his estate, although he lived very badly off his estate because it was very badly run by a number of sort of stewards who ripped him off. But Dostoevsky, of course, couldn't do that, and he had gambling debt. So there was this famous encounter in Baden-Baden when Dostoevsky was embarrassed to have met Turgenev in the street. or to have been seen rather by Turgenev in the street,
yeah.
which Goncharov told him. And so as a man of honor, and especially as a man of honor who owed Turgenev 50 rubles for a loan he'd cadged off him for gambling in Wiesbaden, where the gambler was said, he was honor bound to go and visit Turgenev. And they immediately got into a row because Turgenev had just written this novel Smoke, which was set in Baden-Baden and which was, through the character of Potugin, really just sort of taking a very Westerner view of the expatriate community in Baden and how, and I think it's definitely true, you know, how the Russians sort of, I mean, there's this famous diatribe where he says, Glinka, he's a perfectly decent composer, but he's not the equal of Beethoven, which, you know, the Russians tend to, you know, the Slavophile Russians tend to sort of elevate their cultural heroes to a sort of gargantuan proportion, unwarranted by
was
their
it also a bit
merits.
of the clash between the very European-minded Russian and the more
Absolutely.
Russian-minded Russian?
It was, indeed. And Dostoevsky, who was, he hated the Germans, he hated the Jews, he was very much, by this stage, a sort of rather bitter Russian Slavophile nationalist, famously said to Turgenev, after this row they had over his Western novel Smoke, that he should buy himself a telescope so that he could see Russia better. And I think that really cut with Turgenev, because then later in The Possessed, Bissy, Dostoevsky lampoons the figure of Turgenev in this sort of figure of a guy who's always sort of, as Turgenev was, always sort of smelling of eau de cologne and in a provincial town reading his endlessly boring Turgenev novel.
Yeah.
So I think Dostoevsky really cut quite to the bone with that comment about the telescope, because Turgenev by this stage had really committed himself to a life in exile.
In Europe.
Europe, in Baden. He was very happy there because he had this ménage à trois with Louis and Pauline, and it was an idyllic life for him in many ways. But as a Russian writer, of course, he was separated from his subject and from his readers. And although he would say, as he did, for example, when he went into emigration effectively, he said to Countess Lambert, well, why should the Russian writer write about Russia? Maybe one day I'll want to write something universal. And he definitely thought of himself as a European. I mean, in that argument with Dostoevsky, he said, you know, because Dostoevsky was sort of slagging off the Germans who he thought ripped him off at the roulette tables. And Turgenev says to him, well, I am a German. He actually says he counts himself as a European in that novel.
That, of course, is usually, and I've had it with more of your books about Russia, this is one of the things that kind of strikes you, or at least something you tend to forget, that much more than today, Russia was much more a part of Europe.
Absolutely.
And now, of course, it kind of drifted.
Absolutely, especially with the railways. So Turgenev could get back to his estate at Spasskoye in Oryol province, south of Moscow. I mean, by that time, by the mid-1860s, he could get back there in a couple of days, which, you know, a journey which would have taken 3 weeks when he first met Pauline only 20 years before.
Let's get to Pauline.
Yeah.
She was quite a character as well. She
certainly was.
Let's say, how do you say, the belle of the ball? For a while, everyone wanted to marry her, more or less.
An awful lot of men seem to have fallen in love with her, including a number of composers, Gounod, Berlioz, arguably Bizet, well, I can see why. I mean, she was a force of nature, incredibly sophisticated, intelligent, spoke 4 or 5 languages.
She was born in Paris, right?
Born in Paris in 1821, but from a very, very famous family of Spanish descent. Her father, Manuel Garcia, was the original Count Almaviva in Rossini's Barber of Seville, and he was a tremendously important figure in sort of development of the bel canto voice, and a significant composer of Spanish opera. And her sister, the great Malibran, was this legendary figure.
Yeah, much older, right?
A little bit older, yeah. And had just taken the world by storm in the 1830s in particular, when all the romantics had sort of thrown themselves at her feet because she had this simplicity to her voice, she had this ability, this dramatic expression, and they just thought this was the best. So when she died from a horse riding accident in 1836, 3 years later, Pauline, who had originally thought to be a pianist, she'd been taught by Liszt, she was an extremely good pianist by all accounts, and composed a number of piano works and bigger works too. She went into singing, hit the scene big time in Paris in 1839.
And she was just 16, 17.
She would have been 18, 17 turning 18. And again, Gautier and all these they all fall madly in love with her. Gautier tries to take advantage of her youth and naivety, and as does Musset, who's, of course, well-known poet, great womanizer, had this famous affair with Georges Sand, who champions Pauline. Georges Sand sees in Pauline the embodiment of the feminist artist that she wants to promote, and does promote in the character of Consuelo in her novel, which is based on Pauline's life loosely. And Georges Sand sort of takes under her wing, promotes her through the salon world of Paris.
And Georges Sand, of course, was a mightily influential.
Knows everybody. And she feels that for Pauline's profession to develop, her career to develop, she needs not, some young romantic poet. She needs an older, more stable figure, and chooses for her, really, Louis Viardot, who at that time had established a left-wing Republican journal, La Revue Indépendante, with Georges Sand in the early, in the 1830s, and who was at that time the manager of the Théâtre Italien, which was the leading Italian opera in Paris. And so much to de Musset's sort of disgruntlement, that marriage is affected. But I think, it was never really a marriage of romantic love.
No, it wasn't the most compassionate.
It was a spiritual companionship, for sure. I don't think Pauline could have really been as successful, or I think she really depended on him in many ways that we'll never get to know, really, because the letters between them there aren't that many. But it certainly wasn't a marriage of passion, and she admits as much in some of her more intimate letters to friends.
Yeah.
But he, to begin with, he runs from the Théâtre Italien. He's a very, very sort of noble, upright, conscientious man, but a little bit boring.
Is he not necessarily from the best, richest background, wasn't he?
He was from, his father was a senior lawyer in Dijon, where he grew up. And then what's so interesting about Viardot is he's sort of one of those Frenchmen who goes to Spain in the early 1820s when the Quadruple Alliance is restoring the Spanish monarchy there. So he's just at the back of that whole generation of French officers who, previously under Napoleon and then in the 1820s, are discovering the Iberian world. And so he is a translator. His translation of Cervantes is the most influential in France in the 19th century. He becomes a great expert in Spanish art, and so he becomes the sort of amanuensis of this fascinating figure, not much known about him, called Mikhail Aguado, who was a Spanish banker who basically made a lot of money first by helping the French loot a lot of art, and then by setting up loans.
19th century tradition.
Typical 19th century story. Then had become a major sort of financier to the French and then the Spanish government. So he was mega rich at that time when the Rothschilds and all these other big bankers are becoming major players in European cultural scene. And so as Aguado buys up Théâtre Italien, He buys the lease to Paris Opera. He wants to buy Covent Garden. He wants to buy the Carlos Theatre in Naples. So he's thinking the way to run opera is to become a sort of international impresario owner and circulate the big superstars around Europe in order to have cost efficiencies, I guess. So he sends Louis to London, where Pauline is singing, to recruit her, because the Théâtre Italien has fallen a bit, it had a fire and then it's fallen into a bit of disarray, and he thinks that she's the megastar he needs to buy. So that's where they meet.
Is it like buying Ronaldo, or how should
A little bit like that, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, they certainly, I mean, you know, the prima donnas of that time,
Were
yeah,
really,
I mean, they really, yeah, they had release clauses to match Lionel Messi's today, I guess.
And how did Turgenev run into this?
Well, he meets her in November 1843, when he's back in Petersburg. He's working for the Ministry of Interior in a sort of fairly dull office job. He's just starting out as a poet, and has had his first poems published in an influential journal. And he goes to the opera and he just falls madly in love with her, as did a lot of young men in Petersburg at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, this mega star had turned up. And he effects an introduction to her through Louis, because Louis is a great hunting enthusiast, as Turgenev is, and he arranges a hunting trip and then gets to meet Pauline. And at that time, he was only one of several young men sort of chasing after her, like puppy dogs. And but he sticks to it. And when she comes back for 3 seasons, 3 very successful seasons in Petersburg, and then when in 1846 they depart for Paris, and called Tavenel in the Brie country, where they had this house that they've bought, he sort of follows her there, and then leads this peripatetic existence of going wherever Pauline would go. I mean, he said once famously that he would follow them anywhere, even he would go to Australia, he would go even to Copenhagen, brackets, the most boring city in the world, if the Viados were there. So,
for the people watching this from Copenhagen.
I didn't say that, Turgenev said
that. But one of the striking things whenever you start this kind of high society in 19th century Europe is that everyone knew everyone. And not just within, the cities, but also, throughout the continent.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Of course, many people spoke French, and they spoke the languages, and apparently they vacationed at the same places. So there was this whole network intact of, families and people running into each other. At what moment this became this network, or perhaps you don't agree with me, but when this network became something that started to promote culture and music and literature and
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think that was the first thing that got me into the bigger theme, because obviously the salon had been in existence for some time, and there were particular salons that would promote their artists, maybe, although most of the salons of Paris in the 1830s were political salons.
How should we see a salon? Just perhaps a...
What is a salon?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that people refer to all the time.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, it's kind of difficult to...
Yeah, so
precisely.
So the Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris was the territory of the big salon where big hostesses, it was a woman's domain, would have an open evening on, say, a Thursday. And that Thursday, the same people would come along. As I say, in most salons, it was basically politics that they talked about. But from that point, Madame Joubert in particular was branching out to include more music. And that's where Pauline got her first break. But she's such a fascinating figure because she's so much more than a singer. I mean, she's also a composer, but she's also one of the great salon hostesses of the 19th century. So in Paris, from the 1850s, then in Baden-Baden in the 1860s, then briefly in London in 1870-71 during the Franco-Prussian War when they run for cover.
Yeah.
And then back in Paris, her salon was the place to be. So already in the 1850s, you know, Dickens took train journeys from London with a view to be there. All the, you know, great statesmen, artists, writers of the day were there. And it must have had something to do with Pauline, with her, just the charisma.
Yeah.
I mean, some people, I mean, Henry James, who was at her salon much later,
for going
you know, he complains, he writes about her salon as being very musical and therefore very boring for him because he's not particularly musical and you do a lot of standing around. But you know, he says, you know, that once she sang, it was worth, you know, standing around for 4 hours before you heard her. So she was the centre of this world. And at what point it becomes this tremendously important network, I think it's already there in the 1850s. But I think that, and even more so in the 1860s when in Baden-Baden, I think the atmosphere of Baden as a sort of summer capital of Europe, as it was called, where people are relaxing, where great statesmen are there. You know, every head of every royal family was there. She was, you know, on very good first name terms with Princess Augusta and Wilhelm, you know, to be the Kaiser. And this world of relaxation, I think, was conducive to the more informal artistic salon, musical salon that she and Turgenev were developing. So they built their own concert hall there and so on, and premiered the operettas that Turgenev and Pauline Viardot wrote together, and that sort of put Baden-Baden on the map in some ways. And I think certainly by the 1860s they're playing that role. And Pauline, by this stage, has retired from the stage and is teaching. So she comes from a very distinguished, I mean, the Garcia family really were the, I mean, that tradition, I mean, and that's the other thing about Pauline, which I think gets lost, that tradition of bel canto singing, you know, it does come all the way down. I mean, Cecilia Bartoli is perhaps the most recent descendant of that tradition. So people coming from all over Europe to learn singing with her. And then she was also composing, and she was using the salon to promote young artists who were performing before, you know, kings and queens. And then they're also playing this really important role of cultural intermediaries. So, you know, Russians coming to Baden, which they did because Alexander I was married to the Princess of Baden-Baden. And so it was a place of Russian colonists, really. More or less, yeah. So Russian artists came, and Pauline pioneered their work, performing Russian song, so that it became introduced to the European mainstream, partly as a result of her. And even more importantly, she introduced a lot of Spanish music to the repertoire. And Turgenev was doing the same for literature. You know, he was introducing Ukrainian and Russian writers into translation in European languages.
But I suppose to a certain extent that's how the writers got around and how society got around and met each other. But can you also speak, I think that's very much one of the points of your book, just like, you know, liberals or at least economical liberals like to talk about trickle-down economics. This is like trickle-down cultural. Is that you mean a weird analogy? But in the sense that it's
popular, you mean?
Somehow this thing spread out throughout the continent.
Yes, I mean, obviously the salons are a fairly refined,
yeah, I mean, that's not
world.
For everyone, usually.
No, but I think in terms of the bigger argument of the book, is there a shared European culture at a mass level? I think yes. And I think that's because of the three sort of technologies or ideas or conventions at the centre of the book, which are the railways, which you've mentioned.
Yeah,
mass printing, especially lithography, and copyright, international copyright. You see, if you think about, I mean, opera isn't, I mean, the bifurcation that we have now between high culture and popular culture didn't really exist.
In those days. everyone was whistling tunes.
Doesn't really exist. So, you know, I mean, you know, if Verdi writes an opera, the tunes are very quickly disseminated. I mean, before that, even with Rossini, the tunes are very quickly disseminated into all sorts. You know, bands are playing it. They're playing it in cafes. Organ grinders are playing it. There's a very quick dissemination of music, which I think is partly because it's that people. I mean, the copyists were they always made a bit of money out of selling uncopyrighted copies of music in sheet music form for all sorts of popular dissemination. But it's also because it's the combination of cheap printing, especially lithography, makes it, you know, sheet music just becomes very cheap.
Yeah.
So music magazines, newspapers are giving away sheet music free. For free.
Yeah.
And so it's like the Spotify of the 19th century. It's the main form of reproducing music. And then, of course, you've got the railways. There's a sort of cycle that is introduced. Because the railways, if you think about opera in the day of Rossini, in the day of the horse and carriage, you basically, in an opera house, the money, you're dependent on season ticket holders who buy the boxes, they rent a box for you. And people don't come in from more than maybe 20 kilometres because it's a horse and carriage.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
So you've got basically a static audience, which means that you have to have lots of operas every year. So
keep them coming.
People like Rossini and before him all the composers whose names are now forgotten, and even Donizetti, they were just rehashing a lot of works. Whereas once you got the railways, you can bring in audiences from a much bigger catchment area. You can build bigger theatres because you can fill them with day tickets.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you get the phenomenon. I think Meyerbeer's Robert Le Diable is probably the first. But, you know, Gounod's Faust, most of the Verdi bigger operas, they can run for 300-400 performances. So suddenly, you know, you've got the show, so to speak, and grand opera is the
mass
vehicle
to
for
some
that.
extent. Yeah.
But then that disseminates because the sheet music variations, and there were endless variations. I mean, the composers made their money out of the sheet music. It's disseminated very quickly, and people are performing it at home. Violin and piano, voice and piano. And then because they know the tunes, they want to go and see the opera.
Yeah, so it's
a perfect circle.
Cyclical, yeah.
It's a little bit like Spotify. I mean, because the relationship between live music and recorded music it used to be that you
made a record you performed to sell the record.
To sell the record, but now it's the other way around, right? You go on Spotify, and the only reason why you would go on Spotify, I guess, as a live artist, because you don't make much money out of it, probably.
Yeah. But
it directs your audience to your performance.
But I suppose the railways are clear, and mass printing as well. I wasn't expecting the spread of international copyright.
Yeah, but this became my obsession. Yeah. Copyright's really important because, firstly, until you can guarantee royalties out of your, I mean, look, from the 1840s, it's possible for art to be mechanically reproduced. That means it's also possible for pirates to very quickly sell counterfeits. So it becomes then a battle between the alliance of publishers and creators against pirates. Yeah, there weren't any sort of. I mean, Belgium was a pirate state. Brussels alone had 270 pirate publishers. Yeah, America famously, because Dickens got irate about them, it was a pirate state of the English literature canon, and Naples. Sicily, they just pirated everything out of northern Italy. So Germany, they pirated each other endlessly. So states are coming under pressure from publishers and writers to have domestic laws of copyright. But then the problem becomes, how do you extend that? So Brussels, ironically, is probably the first convention in 1858 where they begin, from that point, there are a lot of bilateral treaties. But that's still not enough because you can still have pirates in third countries.
Yeah.
So it's 1886 is really I think one of the great achievements of the 19th century is the establishment of international copyright. Why is that important? For the creation of an international culture, a shared culture. Because until publishers have the confidence that they can collect royalties in a foreign territory, they won't publish there.
They won't bother, yeah.
They won't bother. So publishing is a short-term, risk-averse venture, both for publishers and for artists. Once you can establish copyright and police it through agencies, then you will invest longer term in your artists. Not only that, works become more standardized. So if you take opera, Verdi, for example, he was very particular that the scores published by Ricordi, his publisher in Milan, would only be given to a theatre, say in Naples or Frankfurt, if they performed the opera as he said they should. Because until that point, they can perform opera however they like. So, I mean, there were versions of Don Giovanni in the 1850s, for example, which they turned Don Giovanni into a grand opera with sort of medleys of Mozart's tunes in the middle of it, and they changed all the characters, and they had a happy ending and stuff like that.
So it's a lot of opera more fun if they're
It's only international copyright that really enables publishing to become internationalized and enables the standardization of works in a way that artists are happy about their moral rights over the work and also their copyright.
I think yesterday you gave a keynote speech over here, and you spoke about the railways and the cheap mass printing and the spread of international copyrights. And you said that these things, you spoke about Europeans, I suppose, and you said it allowed them to discover their own Europeanness, the values they shared with other peoples across Europe, above and beyond their separate nationalities. What values precisely are you getting at? I mean,
in terms of the artists?
Yeah, the artist. Or just what is their Europeanness? Is that something that we can define?
Well, I think that as a result of these technologies, as a result of cross-fertilization across national boundaries, there is a sort of European canon that's formed. I don't mean canon in the sense there's a sort of there's a panel of judges who say that. I mean, it's the market producing this. Because if you think about it, it's the contemporary works for the 19th century were making their way into, all big publishers were, Heinemann, Hachette, they were all producing effectively modern libraries. Because the readership was there for, a cheap paperback of a classic.
Yeah.
And the taste was increasingly for contemporary classics. But it's only the most popular works, the tried and trusted works, that are economically viable. So what's happening through the market is that actually, and it's still true today, you've got the beginning of this phenomenon that 90% of the books bought in a bookshop are the ones on the front table.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
You've got, unfortunately,
yeah.
No, I'm with you. It's unfortunate. So, in other words, that is by the mechanisms of the market a sort of canon that's formed. But it's not only that; it's also that if you take someone like Zola was a massive success.
Yeah, Emile Zola.
Massive success. When he first started coming out with these gritty social novels. And so across Europe, everyone's copying, imitating that format.
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of standardization of the form as well, in terms of the novel, or in terms of
the genre.
There's a genre which is sort of standardized to the point where, I mean, particularly if you think about the impact of Impressionism in the visual arts, for example, I mean, there's so many different national variants of what one might call by the 1880s already a sort of European school called Impressionism, roughly speaking. Everyone's basically doing the same thing by that point. And so people then begin, to complain. They go to a modern art gallery and they can't tell which is the Spanish work, which is the French work, because everyone's doing the same thing. So this is a result artistically of cross-fertilizations between countries, in which not just the railways, but I think the periodical is very important, particularly in the visual arts. There's a boom in periodical publications because
also for novels, right? Like all the big 19th century novels were
quickly into translation. So works go much faster into translation than they would have done, and it becomes more viable to translate. Although there's a big difference, obviously, because the dominant literary cultures, Britain and France, aren't on the whole big translators. Whereas the small literary markets, the Netherlands, classic example, are big translators. Spain, big translator of works. So works in translation become much more critical to this dissemination.
But does this also, or at least a lot of novels have a certain intrinsic moral value in it, or they're about types of tragic heroes, or about heroic heroes doing fun stuff, people that are being admired in books, or people that you feel sad for. So is it also that in this time specifically, because of this whole thing you just described of culture spreading out through Europe, that people are getting more and more acquainted with each other's, so this is what everyone finds sad, this is what everyone finds hopeful. They become more familiar with each other's, hopes and dreams, to put it, weirdly.
I think that, I'm not sure whether people want the same ingredients in, say, a novel. I guess that is happening, I think that there's certainly a growing curiosity for foreign parts in the 19th century novel. So I think that the novel set abroad, or partly abroad, is part of it. And, this is also obviously an age of the beginning of mass tourism, cultural tourism in particular. So, the organisations like Thomas Cook from Britain were sort of shipping lots of Brits around Europe who then develop curiosities, and museums are becoming, the Rijksmuseum here, I mean, this is built in that age when every city wants to put itself on the cultural tourism map by having a major museum, and that becomes part of the tourist trail at that point. So I think there's a growing curiosity about foreign parts.
And about each other.
In readerships. Whether there's I would argue that there's a greater sense of connectivity, which is, obviously one of the, as we've been discussing in our civic, what do we call it? Civic platform? Council. What's so unique about Europe is its density of different cultures, languages. That's what's special about Europe. And I think that what the railways did above all is that, it's not true anymore, but, by the end of the 19th century, every small town in Western Europe, certainly, had a railway station. And it might be at the end of only a little branch line, but it meant that everyone could be in a big city by the end of the day. And I think that created a different sort of mindset of, it'd be hard to measure, and people haven't really written about it, but I think that, I mean, Edmund Goss in his wonderful memoir about growing up in Devon in the 19th century, I mean, he, you know, for him it was the Crimean War that did it, because suddenly there was an international event and they were getting out maps and reading the newspapers. But it sparked in him, from his little village in Devon, a sort of interest in Europe.
Yeah. And can you also say that because of the mass, all of a sudden the newfound mass audience, this was also the start of like, say, the superstar, to put it as so? I mean, in your book you describe, at the end of the book you describe all the funerals of all the great, you know, you had 300,000 people.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Going to the...
So again, you have 400,000 people turned out in Petersburg.
Yeah. And Verdi had also like 300,000.
And Verdi, probably 500,000 in Milan. And it's hard to imagine, sort of, I don't know.
Well, we had André Hazes.
I shouldn't name a composer who might drop dead, but I mean, you know, even for who's the world's most famous writer? I mean, you wouldn't get more than a crowd of. I mean, you know, they'd be down there with poor old Flaubert, who was had his funeral in Rouen, and they thought it was for his dad, the old doctor. I mean, you know, who's this guy Flaubert? Poor Gustave. But anyway, so they were rich. Victor Hugo, famously rich, great. You know, I mean, look at his funeral. I mean, it was a state funeral. I mean, he was put in the Pantheon.
Yeah.
So these were massive celebrities in a way that is difficult to conceive now for an artist or a writer. I mean, they don't have that sort of moral authority anymore, but they were at a time. I mean, I think the key to it is probably that they were both, you know, if you think of all those figures, Verdi, Hugo, etc., they were figures of great national pride at a time of cultural nation building, so they were central to those projects, which is partly, I think, why, you know, Verdi had such a big turnout for his funeral in 1901. But they were also more than that. They were, I think, figures of pride in. They might be Italian, but they're world figures.
Yeah, they're world figures. Yeah,
they're world figures. So that makes them more special. And I'm not sure whether that symbiosis between having, you know, a figure who's a great national hero and also a world figure. I mean, the closest comes to mind immediately is like someone like Nelson Mandela or something, who is both a source of great pride in South Africa, but also
all around the world. He's the same moral
has that
figure,
moral authority. Or otherwise, I'd be struggling to find anyone to put up there at that level. Where, you know, when Verdi dies, he's on the front page of every newspaper across the world.
Yeah. So to take a different direction and make a jump into the future, if that was this whole area of this whole period where Europe grew more connected, well, obviously it grew less connected. What do you say would be the main agent for the...
nationalism.
Nationalism.
War.
But nationalism is tricky, because you mentioned as well that many of these museums and you know, the arts were also very much used as a force for nation building.
The two are not mutually exclusive. They run in parallel. What I've tried to do, I think some people didn't quite get what I was trying to do. Maybe it was not clear enough. But what I was trying to do in the book was show that there are sort of two trajectories going on simultaneously, more or less. There's the trajectory of growing cosmopolitanism in the cultural economic sphere, which is effectively globalization in the 19th century, where we all, you know, circulate the same ideas and read the same books and so on. And at the same time, partly in reaction to that, there's a different trajectory of political nationalism. And I think it is a later 19th century phenomenon. I think it is, you know, 1848, the years of revolution, democratic nationalist revolutions, which failed. That is, I think, a turning point. Because before that, I don't think there's a contradiction at all between cultural nationalism and cosmopolitanism. In fact, Goethe said famously of the Germans that they couldn't ever be a nation state because they were too cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
You know, they were too much influenced by France and Italy, and they didn't really have a strong German literature or theatre, you know, so or they were too open as a culture, I think is what he was trying to say. Whereas, obviously, when political nationalism becomes ascendant, partly in reaction to this cosmopolitanism, but partly under its own steam, and you have states being built from above, essentially, with Bismarck and Cavour, and then, as you know, culture becomes a tool for nationalists, because it's, yeah, you put Goethe's Pride of Place in your national curriculum. And so after 1871, there's a very, you know, forceful sort of German curriculum of, you know, children learning by heart Schiller and Goethe as part of this project of nation building. You know, they're not always mutually exclusive, but there's like this wave of cosmopolitanism which just, I think, increases. And, you know, 1914 is the high point of cultural cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, that's usually, like Vienna in those times.
Yeah, the Ballet Russe comes to power.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't have a richer cosmopolitanism in the cultural sphere than you had in Europe circa 1914. But by that stage, you also have ascendant political nationalisms. And of course, you know, with the First World War, that then is exploded, never to be put again. And perhaps put together again. And perhaps it was, as Stefan Zweig says, you know, it was always an illusion. You know.
He of course wrote famously about, you know, the world of yesterday.
The world of yesterday, nostalgically viewed from the perspective of 1941. This metaphor that he uses, you know, of Blériot, this great French aviator, doing the cross-channel flight, and the youth of Vienna thinking, well, the national boundaries are now dead, because if it's as easy to cross them as that, there's no need for these boundaries anymore. So they thought they were entering a sort of international upland of brotherhood and openness, and that wars between nations were a thing of the barbaric past. Well, of course, it's a complete illusion, and probably ever since, as the idea of putting it together again, which I suppose has been part of the European project since 1945. Yeah, it's always essentially been a nice idea, but probably an illusion. I'm not meaning to say that we should put it in the dustbin. I'm just saying that it has its uses, and it's good as an ideal, but it's not something that can be ever more than probably an aspiration.
Because in modern political discourse, there are a couple of ways of looking at the European project, European Union. And of course, in every country has its own problems with, you know, people being vehemently against Europe, and the others want to embrace it. And I suppose one of the reasons, you know, that's one of the phrases you hear a lot is, you know, we have to have the European because we don't ever want to have the Second World War again. One is more pragmatic and say, well, you know, we need to be an economical powerhouse to compete in the world. But every now and then you have someone who says, well, Europe is also a culture. And, you know, before I'm a Dutch person, I'm also European. And how do you feel about the role culture has in that debate nowadays?
Well, I'd like to think it's absolutely central to it. I mean, certainly, you know, they have Ode to Joy as the European anthem. I mean, if it's going to mean anything, then it must mean that they see Europeanness partly in terms of our identification with, you know, Shakespeare, Dante, Goethe, everybody, you know, that we can think of as not just a heritage. I mean, I can't stand that word heritage. It's not a heritage, because these are living,
Yeah.
constantly changing entities, which enable us to question ourselves all the time, right? So, but I think that as a sort of set of cultural references always to go back to is absolutely central to who we are, and has a lot of life still in it. But we have to, it can't be just high culture. I mean, I think that's been the problem of the adoption of culture by the European Union, that it's sort of, it's all high culture.
Yeah, of course, that's like the easy target for populists who are usually against high culture.
Yeah, why should we subsidize opera, etc.?
Yeah.
And that is the problem, because at the same time as we may still, identify with these great figures, we do live in a world of globalization, where the mass culture of America, everywhere else it has probably, for the young generation and the future, maybe undermined is not the right word, but it's diluted the ability, the force of those figures, I think. And so, but Europe's always, if Europe has been so dynamic throughout its history, culturally, it's precisely because it has always been able to take from the outside and regenerate.
Yeah.
And so, Europe isn't a closed box. It's an open, revolving door system, if you like.
Yeah.
And so it will constantly refresh and regenerate, provided we see Europe and Europeanness as something open, as an entity that's open, not just some white heritage that has to be sort of preserved, but as something that is, for sure, must be based on certain European values, yeah? So it's the values that count.
Now I'm going to have to ask you, what are those values? Which is
I think we know what those values are. The values go back to 1789, effectively. Or 1776, the American Revolution before, or natural rights, human rights, and all of that discourse. The freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that enable all those great artists that we claim as speaking for us as Europeans, that was the oxygen that they breathe.
Yeah.
So that's the importance of the values, and anyone or any political movement that tries to sort of close off part of that sort of system of breathing, if you like, by saying we can't have this, we must exclude that, is taking away from that. So I'm all for an open Europe, and I think that you can't really, you can't go to any major cultural figure and Turgenev, the family comes from the Mongols, effectively.
Yeah.
Their ancient descendants came in with Genghis Khan. Garcia, she's from Spain. Everyone everyone who's European is
from somewhere else.
It's from somewhere else, really. Yeah. But it's the identification with this tremendous intercourse that we can have as Europeans, because we are so diverse, that makes us Europeans, I think.
Now, every couple of years here in the Netherlands, there's a new updated canon created by a bunch of wise people. So if you see this book as an open solicitation for the European Union, and they ask you, Mr. Fages, do you want to compose a canon for us? Do you think something would work in Europe?
A canon for whom?
Yeah, for everyone.
How does this judgment work? Is there
this is something we argue about a lot in the Netherlands. But usually it's a panel of people who come up with 21, what we call it windows, but 21 people and books and
Oh, I
things that
see.
happen.
Yeah, no, I'm not into list making like that.
You're not into list making.
I mean, I know newspapers that seem to be, especially in Britain, they endless, especially The Guardian, which I find constantly annoying, is always full of lists, the top 50 books and this sort of stuff. What's the point?
Books.
What's the point of all these lists?
5,000 movies.
We don't need lists. I mean,
no, but to construct a more of a European identity, if you say to the people in Europe, saying, listen, if you want to go back and look at European history, these are the 25 people you should know, or these are the 25.
I don't think it works like that. I wouldn't want to say to anyone, you have to read that. I mean, I'm always recommending books and authors, but I don't think there's. Should children all be made to read Shakespeare or go to Shakespeare in the theatre? I mean, yeah, it's good for their soul, but is it necessary? I mean, if you start trying to sort of force a canon on people, it won't be effective. It will rebound. People will discover Shakespeare at some point, and they'll discover the richness of Shakespeare or Dante or Goethe or whatever you want it to be. They will discover that for themselves, and it's not worth having that unless it's a discovery of their own, is it? It's not really worth that. I mean, at the moment, I think we're culturally in such. I mean, I'm very pessimistic culturally. To be honest, I'd be happy if children read any books, frankly. So I mean,
or just
So I mean, I think just reading matters. I think reading a whole book matters. It's a question of. I don't think there's a sort of set canon in that way, or could be, or should be. There are people, my own personal favourites. But I mean, I wouldn't say to anyone, you haven't lived until you've read Flaubert, which I suppose would be my top.
Your guy, yeah. Is there any contemporary figure comparable to Turgenev or Viardot, who, a creator of art, who is somehow has the same, or perhaps the same influences is perhaps a bit much, but who's like this figure that spreads out a certain European cultural sensibility? Is it possible to think of contemporary figures that could, 100 years from now, someone also write a book called The Europeans?
And it would be, that's a tricky question.
Because superstars have become, of course, much more international, I suppose.
Superstars, the literary superstars are international, aren't they?
But I suppose music superstars even more, they're very cosmopolitan. It's not really.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of popular music, you mean? I mean, I'm not quite sure that contemporary classical, as we might call them, composers, have an international sort of profile in that way. But certainly, if you think of the writers who are probably most read in translation, they are international in perspective, and probably as a result have less national character in the sense that they are writing about universal themes in a way that doesn't necessarily situate themselves in any community, because we are just much more international as people, aren't we? Especially the intelligentsia is, I suppose. So I think, but I think in terms of the Europeans, people who represent that sort of, I think they've tended to be writers who in their time were politically somehow. So I'm thinking back to Václav Havel, maybe, at the time when he became sort of great political figure. This Central Europe, everyone got slightly romantic about, I suppose. He emerged as the sort of quintessential European, or perhaps before that, Günter Grass, maybe.
Yeah, Kundera, probably.
In the sense that he represented this German sort of German culture coming to terms with itself, and that was somehow seen as, I don't know, but I think that is probably more led by contemporary politics than it is by a literary sensibility, if that's what you're getting at.
Okay. I'm going to open the floor for questions in a little bit, so you can already think about the question you might want to ask. I've got one more before, one more question. One thing I was thinking about myself. When reading the book, you have these three things you keep bringing up. You have the railways, you have the mass printing, and you have copyrights. And I was thinking whether you could turn these things around and also argue that for the past, so many years, they've also become more not something that only brings people together, but also divides it a lot. I really couldn't think of anything against copyright. I'm pro-copyright.
Some people aren't, so I'm glad to hear.
When you look at railways and cheap travel, this is one of the things that Europe worries about a lot. Yeah. And this is one of the things where every populist party in every country says, we should close the borders. We want our borders back.
Yeah.
So this is also one of the things that, 100 years or 150 years later on.
But they're saying they want the borders closed because they don't want migrants or because they don't want tourists?
Migrants usually, yeah. So it's not necessarily travel, but of course travel is one of the things that you have Venice, you have parts of Barcelona, you have parts of Paris, and parts of Amsterdam where people feel like we're losing our own city to tourists.
No. I mean, Amsterdam, I'm told, has 18 million visitors a year, which is too many for a city the size of
it's
Amsterdam.
A lot,
And what I wonder about that, I mean, I find that the phenomenon very interesting because you could say that connectedness, that sense of connected. I mean, what is it that? Okay, some people come to Amsterdam. We know what they're coming for, but they're coming for the coffee houses and the red light district and the sort of the liberal atmosphere and the party culture of Amsterdam, right? But I mean, if you go to say, I don't know, they go to Prague, it's not quite Amsterdam, is it? So what do they? Or they go to Lisbon. I mean, these are cities that are just inundated with similar levels of tourism. What is it that people are doing? What is it that they're looking for? I find that an interesting question. I mean,
what do you reckon?
Well, I think they want to. It's the city break, isn't it? It's the fact that the Ryanair flight it makes a city break, especially if it's an Airbnb or cheap hotel. It makes it a very affordable. Well, what the Victorians in the age of Thomas Cook would have called the jolly jaunt. Yeah. So it's like, it's the long weekend away in which there will be an element of taking in the atmosphere, whatever that is, and there's a certain amount of alcohol. If you're English, certainly a certain amount of alcoholic indulgence. But it will also include, I think it will also include, if it's Amsterdam, maybe they go to the Van Gogh Museum, maybe they go to the Reich Museum. So it's a sort of sense that they want to connect into something which is similar because they live in another bit of Europe. So I'm not sure whether that's true, but I think that part of this thing of wanting to go away is sort of wanting the sense of connection, that it's familiar, because we all know what it is to sit on a pavement outside a Paris cafe and drink your overpriced coffee. We know what that's the cafe experience. I mean, so it's similar to what you might do elsewhere, but it's different because it's in Paris, not in Amsterdam. So,
but I do sometimes wonder if you have some of those tourists and they book a Ryanair flight to Amsterdam and you just take them to Prague, if they'll notice.
They wouldn't know the difference, probably.
There's a wonderful painting by James Tissot in your book, the English Tourist, I believe it's called, where you see. I think it's somewhere in the late 19th century, and you see someone exiting the museum,
the National Gallery,
looking on his watch, and I think that the clock in the background says like 11:30, so they must have run through the museum to see it. So already back in the day, people were worried about
ticking off
fast,
the list
fast
of
tourism.
what they're meant to do. So I think, so in a sense, what they want is something different. I don't know. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. What is it that people are looking for? So to some extent, everyone's looking for the same. They want the same thing. So they do the same trail. They'll go to Anne Frank's house and then the Rice Museum and then they'll go to a nightclub or something. I don't know what they'll do. But so what is it that they're looking? Why? Why are they bothering? There's a wonderful novel. It's a Huysmans novel. The Frenchman. Who decides from Paris he's going to go to London, and he decides on his way to Gare du Nord he'll stop at this then famous Parisian English. So it would now be called the English pub, but then it was like the English restaurant or something. And he goes inside, and it's a complete replica of what it would be in London. And he has such a good time there, he decides not to go to London in the end at all and goes home. So I mean, it's a sort of virtual tourism. I mean, but I think that there is a sense of connectedness that people want.
You have, yeah, and in the song by Simon and Garfunkel, I'm not going to sing it, but they sing "I'll come to look for America," and I think can something be said about Europe as well? That to a certain extent, everyone feels, at least when we should see Paris, we should see London. And it's more than just, I suppose, ticking off just a box like, oh, I should have been there. I think, well, perhaps this is my naive sentimentality, but I do feel like most of the people I know feel like, well, Europeans, we need to
have been to
we
these
need
places.
to have been some of those places because they're so close and we're so familiar with them. It's like a moral obligation to travel every now and then.
Well, yeah, but I like to think that there is in that an element of understanding or empathy or solidarity with, at least the Parisians, if not the French when you go to Paris, at least with the Amsterdammers, if not the Dutch when you come to Amsterdam. I like to think that there's a sort of investment in one's near neighbours as Europeans.
Yeah.
I think there probably is. Maybe that's me being sentimental.
Yeah, well we can both share our sentiment. I think it's time, if there's any questions over here. I know it's always small. There's one over there. And I'm supposed to repeat your question in the microphone.
Okay. It's not really a question, but I would be interested in listening to your analysis about the current cultural moment that we find ourselves in, where European values are being attacked by illiberal forces in the right and left, and by the populist part, but also by the waves of censorship we're getting from American cancel culture. And,
Wow.
Yeah, so the question would be how, I'm going to make it very short, how would you rate the current cultural moment in Europe, where so much of our European values, probably that you mentioned earlier, are being attacked by all sorts of forces from within and without?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's the subject of a whole seminar, isn't it, and more. I think that there was a point in the discussion among cultural practitioners at the seminar I gave a talk, a sort of keynote talk yesterday about the internet and whether it can, because, obviously theatre and music in particular are going through a real existential crisis. I mean, and I think that it's, that the problem of that, I think we probably have underestimated how much we miss live theatre, live music, how important that is. Because the internet is not, it's not the public. Performing, the people watching this on the stream are not in a public sphere. We are in a public sphere. It's the fact that I can see your face, I can see you nodding. There's an interaction going on between you and me as there is between an actor and the audience or a performer and listeners that is really important. And it's easy to think of the internet as sort of but it's not. It's just connecting people of a like mind and predisposition, all from their living rooms or all from their bed. I mean, that's not a public. So I think, for me, that's the most worrying aspect of the COVID crisis and the way it interacts with the technologies available to culture, broadly speaking. That I think the form of threat to European values that I worry about most are the fact that there's a breakdown of genuinely public media that is trusted, and the internet is just reinforcing, echo chambers, the echo chambers of Twitter, the echo chambers of Instagram. We just want to hear. And I fear, you mentioned cancel culture. I mean, I really do fear for the higher education sphere. Luckily, I'm about to retire, but I feel that at university level, there's so much censoriousness and judgmental attitudes among students. I've begun to think that students don't even want to be educated. They just want their prejudices reinforced with the information they need. So, I see my job as an education is to, you can't teach people how to think, but to help themselves to learn how to think. But we can't think if we've already made up our minds about the world, about other people's opinions. So I'm very worried about that what's special about Europe is this density and this constant cross-fertilization which has been so enriching of our culture, and we're in danger of sort of breaking down into little atoms. That's what worries me.
Anyone else?
This morning I heard for the first time on Radio 4, it's the classical music here, a song by Mikhail Aguado.
Oh, did you like it?
Great. It was only afterwards was said, I said, oh great, I've heard it now.
Yes.
So it exists.
Yes. Well.
It was on the Dutch radio. My question is, after reading your book, was in the time that all these developments were in European culture, Netherlands didn't exist, only for paintings? What was the situation in Europe? So the Netherlands, we had the Geographical, the Rijksmuseum, everything. But in your book, it's only mentioned as via those, he loves Dutch paintings. Yes.
Okay. But I'm not writing I wasn't setting out to write a
nationalist question.
No, okay. I beg your pardon, but I wasn't setting out to write a comprehensive, in any form, history of 19th century culture. I was let off the hook, perhaps, by the fact that I was interested in these three people and the worlds they brought in to the European mainstream. So, obviously, in particular, Russia and Spain. If they'd spent more time in the Netherlands, I would have devoted more pages to the Netherlands. So I'm sorry.
I think there was a question over there.
Yeah.
I'm right behind you.
Hello.
So where would you put, if you think it's a wise idea, the geographical boundaries of Europe?
Aha.
We briefly discussed it early on, and especially now by picking someone like Turgenev. Some people might argue that now Russia may not be entirely part of the European sphere anymore. I'm curious to see what your point of view is on that.
So the question would be, where do you put the borders of Europe?
Today or in the 19th century?
In the 19th century, I think it's a bit more clear, but more today.
Ooh. Well, that is, culturally, it would be a different set of borders, I suppose, than geopolitically. But I think, as I said before, I'd like to see the external borders conceived more openly. I mean, if we think of the Mediterranean as the center of Europe, really, in terms of its long history, then you can't just say it's the northern littoral of the Mediterranean. The Maghreb, the Eastern Mediterranean are just as important. So, and those cross-fertilizations across the Mediterranean have always been part of the European world. So I think it would be, we could do it geopolitically, but I think culturally it would be difficult. And obviously if you put Russia into the mix, that confuses it completely, because you can go to Khabarovsk or any of the other far eastern Russian cities.
Vladivostok, yeah.
They're on the Pacific, essentially, but they're basically European cities, insofar as they are Siberian cities that have been colonized and developed as replicas of European Russian cities, for the most part. There's some things that, they've had the Gulag experience, so that's sort of transformed them in some ways. But they're essentially, Christian European cities. So, but, you wouldn't call them European geopolitically, probably.
Because they're half the world away.
So half the world away. But then on the other hand, Gorbachev famously, and this is the classic Russian way of thinking of Europe since Tatishev in the great geographer of the 18th century. Europe was from the Atlantic to the Urals. But the Urals, they aren't really mountains. It's not like the Alps or something. I mean, they're pretty small. I mean, many parts of the world, they'd just be called hills. So that's not a natural division either. I mean, there's no real difference between one side of the Urals and the other. So the bigger boundary is harder to delineate. And then, of course, if you think of the historically on top of that, I mean, what do you do with the fact that the Ottomans were in southeastern Europe for a very long time and have left a big cultural imprint there? Equally, the Moors in Spain left a big cultural input there. So, they aren't really culturally, I think, any fixed boundaries we can stick by.
So I suppose the whole idea of boundaries or borders, from a cultural perspective, it's just hard.
Well, Spengler wrote this book, The Decline of the West, in 1918, wasn't it? And he says in that book that Europe is just the sort of nose at the end of this long animal called Asia.
Yeah.
And I guess geographically that's what it is. So if we think about where Europe is today, it could be that it just becomes that. If there's nothing to distinguish Europe from Eurasia, if Europe is just a destination for tourists to come and see old buildings, or it's just a market for people to sell into things, then it will become that. So if Europe's managed to sort of have boundaries defined by this thing called Europeanness, then it must have something more than just a market or a place to accept tourists because we've got old buildings to show them. It has to be more than that. So that it depends on the creation or preservation or regeneration of some sort of European identity, which must come down ultimately to culture, because I can't think of any other way of, we don't have empires anymore, thank God, and we're not really a big hitting force in the world anymore. So it has to be culture, has to be what defines us.
Thanks so much. That's it, everyone.
Great.
Give a special welcome or special thanks again for Orlando Figes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. One more thing.
That brings the program to a close. Thank you so much, Orlando, for being here. It's been my privilege and my pleasure having you. If you're watching at home or wherever you are, thanks for tuning in. Thanks to all the people here present. Thanks for the Bali for having us. Please take a look online on the forum for European culture so you can see all the other events. Thanks again. Have a lovely evening and a nice weekend. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.